joining that 0-16 club. But they made a lot of noise in the offseason. I mean, getting Todd Haley as your offensive coordinator, Jarvis Landry, Carlos Hyde. What offseason move do you really see as being the biggest as a key to their success?
Well, it's a good question because with John Dorsey, I mean, he came in and he essentially cleaned house. So there's a lot to pick from. They just did their first inter-squad scrimmage yesterday, and I was out there, and I'll tell you what, Jarvis Landry looks so damn good. He's so impressive. And, yeah, it's inter-squad scrimmage, and you can't read too much into it, but John Dorsey was saying yesterday, I forget what the exact number is. It's like 30. Like, he needs 30 catches in his fifth season to pass Larry Fitzgerald as the most catches in the first 5 years in the league for any receiver in NFL history. So this is a guy who he's averaging 100 catches a year. He's got 4 years under his belt and 400 catches. And he's a guy who in Miami, and part of this is Tannehill, part of this is kind of our perception of what slot receivers are. He averaged like 8 or 9 yards a catch, and so everybody just says, oh, he's an intermediate route slot guy. And they almost use it, to demean him. This dude gets separation in a phone booth. This dude gets separation down the field. So I think no matter what, whether or not it's Tyrod Taylor or Baker Mayfield, and we all pretty much expect both of them to start, a number of games this year. At some point, you have to expect Tyrod hands the reins over. Whoever it is under center, those are probably the two biggest additions because quarterback's the most important position, and because since 1999 the Browns have not had that question answered. So I would say Tyrod Taylor and Baker Mayfield are your two biggest additions, but I think Jarvis Landry is going to be the most important because he's going to help out whoever it is who's under center so much. He's a really good football player, and not only did they trade for him and give up picks, but then they sign him to that contract. So they really believe that he's going to make a big impact. So I would say Jarvis Landry is going to prove to be the most important addition, but it's going to be because of the impact he has on both Taylor and Mayfield. And it is Tyrod's job, certainly to start. And I think there might actually still be more from Tyrod Taylor that we didn't necessarily see in Buffalo.
I agree.
People forget he didn't become a starter until he was 25 years old. And then he was in Buffalo, with Rex Ryan and all these different coordinators and LaShawn McCoy, and that was pretty much the offense. He didn't have any weapons. Sammy Watkins was – it was a bunch of crappy receivers and tight ends, and Sammy Watkins was always hurt. So I think Tyrod Taylor has a little bit more. I don't think he has more to prove that he's going to be the quarterback in the future for the Browns. I mean, obviously everybody expects Baker to take the field and to take that job as his at some point this year. But long answer for a pretty simple question. I'd say Jarvis Landry is going to be the most important right away. You're just going to see Jarvis Landry's impact on that team.
Well, and the thing about Jarvis Landry, even if he's running these 8-yard routes or these 9-yard routes, he's not getting you a 25-yard reception or anything like that. I don't know. That to me, that just kind of seems like the guy you want, especially if you're throwing a guy like Baker Mayfield out there, because you don't want Baker saying, this is my number one wide receiver. I got the ball to him 25 yards down the field, in my opinion. I think it's the right wide receiver to have to kind of work somebody into an offense. It's simple passes, it's quick cuts, it's things along those lines. Am I right in saying that?
100%. Tyrod Taylor, too. We know Tyrod does not necessarily specialize in the deep ball, and we know he's, if there's anything that holds him back, it's that he's a little too cautious. So he's going to work those intermediate routes. But you nailed it. For a quarterback like Baker Mayfield, the first thing he has to do is to get comfortable with fitting those balls into those tight windows, recognizing defenses, watching a guy, figuring out with his receivers when you need to cut off a route, when you need to drop into coverage because you're playing against the zone. Jarvis Landry is going to shorten Baker Mayfield's learning curve whenever Baker does get in there. And then they have a lot of other weapons and options. They re-signed Duke Johnson. That's kind of something that maybe flies under the radar, but he's a guy who's really good in blitz pickup and really good out of the backfield. They brought in Carlos Hyde and they drafted Nick Chubb, so he should have a running game, and hopefully he's got some protection back there, whether you're talking about Tyrod or Baker. I think just offensively they upgraded at so many different spots that now when you put Baker Mayfield, and they've had a good offensive line, now when you put Baker Mayfield out there, it doesn't feel like it did in '99 with Tim Couch or even with Johnny Manziel a couple of years ago. You feel like you're setting them up to succeed, and that was the big sort of kicker that they haven't been able to get over that hump over the past couple seasons with all the different quarterbacks sliding in.
No, yeah, you mentioned the additions of Chubb, Hyde, and the re-signing of Johnson. I really like Duke Johnson's game coming out of the backfield, catching those passes. And I was okay with Carlos Hyde coming home, like, to play for his hometown team. But then they drafted Nick Chubb. They spent all that draft capital on him. Me, being a big fantasy guy, I'm kind of seeing how they all fit in the game plan and kind of like feed off of each other. How do you really see that working out? Do you have one running back in particular that you see might take the reins as the top dog?
Well, I'm probably the worst guy to ask about Browns fantasy because I have a steadfast rule. I do not draft Browns in fantasy. It's just like betting on the Browns. Like boys, don't bet on the Lions. Let me tell you that. That's the number one rule of gambling is don't bet on the
I don't really want to talk about my bets on the Lions. That officially didn't happen.
It'll completely ruin your Sunday. If the Browns or Lions lose and you also lose $100, then your entire week is ruined. Whereas maybe just your Monday is ruined if just the Browns or Lions lose.
You did it to yourself. That's why.
Exactly. Like you should know better. And look, I've had a good reason not to draft any Browns fantasy-wise for the last couple seasons because they've sucked. But this year, I think there is some capabilities there. Except I think the plan is, especially, I think they brought Hyde in because they don't want to put too much tread on Chubb's tires in years 1 and 2. And, as a running back, you get smarter. You start to figure out how to hit the hole. Think about Le'Veon Bell, the way he hit the hole. And I know that's very unique to him, but, players get smarter as the years go. And for a running back, that sort of high-intensity position, you don't want to just throw them out there in year 1 and say, we're going to give you the ball 280 times and, go kill yourself. So I think they drafted Chubb with the idea that, next year, the year beyond, that's going to be your guy. I don't know if I would make sure I'm getting value if I draft any of the 3 of them. Duke's going to be on the field a lot in different capacities. So if you're in a PPR league, Duke makes a lot of sense as like a flex play. But Chubb and Hyde they're both going to get a fair amount of carries, and the idea is going to be, we're not trying to burn out either of them. So I'm not sure either of those guys are worthy of very high picks, or just know that neither of them are going to be that sort of bell cow guy.
Yeah, that's kind of where we were at. It's kind of honestly the same things going on up here in Detroit, where there's a few options. There's a third down pass catcher there, so you don't really have a true 3-down back regardless of what they do, and they're just in our opinion plenty worth staying away.
And that's the trend of the league. That's the trend of the league right now is everybody's going stable backs. So I look around and I go. I keep doing all these mock drafts, and I'm like, within the top 20 or so picks, you can get a Melvin Gordon or a Fournette or somebody who, he's going to be the guy. And, there's always a couple other guys, a third down back or whatever, some guy that they drafted that they're going to try to work in there. But it's tricky. For fantasy purposes, and I know this is now turning into a fantasy podcast, for fantasy purposes, I recommend getting your 2 backs early. Try to find a guy that is going to be the guy because there's just not that many of them anymore.
Oh, no. And there's so many wide receivers now, too.
Exactly.
More wide receivers are on the field than running backs at any given time anyway, so there's more room for people to come out of nowhere. So.
All right, so the question is then for you, how many games does Baker Mayfield start this season?
It's a good question. I really think it's going to be dictated by their success. I would say, I think the bye is week 11, so I would say 5 or 6 is a safe bet.
Okay.
If you just assume they're going to wait for the bye, which is sort of the old sort of standard, that's when we'll hand the keys over, when we can get him 2 weeks to prepare for his first start. I think that's reasonable. Here's the thing is, it's a big debate here in town. Like, should Baker start week 1? If he's good enough, Russell Wilson did, Carson Wentz did, why shouldn't Baker? Well, they've traded a 3rd-round pick for Tyrod Taylor. This is their plan. And unless Baker is John Elway reincarnate, they're not going to start in week 1, and they're going to try to ease him in. And they've been telling us that since they traded for Tyrod Taylor. I mean, Hugh Jackson took flack back in March or April or whenever when they made that deal, because he immediately named the starter, and people are going, why do you have to commit to him right now? Well, it's because they traded a 3rd-round pick for him, and because their plan for Baker is not to make him start day 1, and that would have been their plan for whoever it was they drafted 1st overall, provided it was a quarterback. So I think it would take some really, really crazy stuff happening for Baker to start anytime before week 5 or 6. If the team's 0-6 at that point, Hugh Jackson's probably on his way out anyways. So then you start making those decisions. But as long as Hugh Jackson has any say in this, Tyrod Taylor is your starter because it's pretty clear he gives you a better chance to win right away. And, oh, by the way, Hugh Jackson's record is 1-31 as head coach. Like, he has to win very, very soon in order to protect his job.
No, because Tyrod Taylor, he was a playoff quarterback last year, and his best offensive weapon was Charles Clay, and he missed like half of the season. So I'm really interested to see how he's going to fit in, especially, Josh Gordon. Oh, man. I know I'm hyped something to get carried away with, but I'm just seeing all this stuff on Twitter about him. I'm really excited to see Tyrod throwing that deep ball over Gordon. Do you see like a scenario, though, where we don't see Baker Mayfield at all during this upcoming season?
I really can't. They would have to – their schedule is so tough, guys. We're all expecting them to be much better, but we're all expecting them to be 5 or 6 win team. So I think at some point the writing's going to be on the wall. You're out of the playoff race. Let's see what Baker gives you. I could also see, let's say they're 5-5 through 10 weeks. Maybe, and this is what happened with Johnny Manziel, interestingly, maybe you talk yourself into, Brian Hoyer / Tyrod Taylor isn't getting us over the hump. We're going to put the kid in there, and we're going to see if it makes us really, really good or really, really bad. Well, they made that mistake a couple of years ago. It was a different, it was a different group, obviously, a different front office regime. But here in Cleveland, it's not going to play very well if you're in the playoff race and Tyrod Taylor's playing well and you just bench him. Like that, the chance to make the playoffs will rule the day. So that would be probably the only situation is if you're right about 500. And because I don't think there's any way this team goes 10-6 this year. This team is like, wow, we're a contender. They're not going to be Jacksonville this year, and that's okay. Like all they have to do is take baby steps. They did not win a game last year, so anything over 4 wins, people are going to be stoked about.
Right.
So yeah, I really can't see any possibility that Tyrod plays the entire season, with the exception of them being way, way better than anybody expects. And again, the schedule's brutal. They start with Pittsburgh and New Orleans in the first 2 weeks, so they're going to be 0-2 almost definitely, and playing behind the 8 ball a little bit. So I think midseason, it'll hopefully for their sake, it'll be a pretty easy transition. And give both Tyrod Taylor, Baker Mayfield, and the front office credit. Like everybody has, like the front office has been really, really insistent. Tyrod's our guy until he's not. Like right now, that's what's happening. And plans change, but this is our plan, and we'll let you know if the plan changes. And both Tyrod and Baker have handled it very, very well. So I think they targeted Tyrod because they knew he'd be able to handle that situation. And for him, you don't want to be the guy who bitches and moans as he gives up his job or doesn't, mentor Baker Mayfield properly because he's playing for his next contract. He's hoping to be a starter somewhere. He's hoping to sign a long-term deal after this year. And that's not the type of guy he is based on everything I've heard. Like this is Dorsey said yesterday, he was on our airwaves yesterday. That's why I keep citing him. He was on 92.3 and he said going back to when Tyrod was coming out, I talked to Frank Beamer, and he said he's the best leader I've ever had in the history of Virginia Tech football, and as long as I've been involved in Virginia Tech. So for Beamer to say that at that point, that's the way Dorsey thinks about him. That's why Dorsey targeted him. He knows he's the ideal guy to, A, get this team some wins this year, but B, sort of gracefully hand the reins over to Baker.
Right. All right. Let's do this one quick because I really want to get to talking some OSU with this OSU alum. So I want a final record prediction.
5-11.
5-11. Okay. I got them 7-9, but I'm also a sucker for the Browns pretty much every year because when you're born and raised a Lions fan, I think it just happens. I think you just kind of fall into the trap.
More power to you, brother.